A silent scream echoed through the 50th floor, louder than any gunshot Dante Russo had ever fired. Outside the soundproof glass, Chicago was a frozen tomb, draped in white and shivering under a 3 a.m. moon. But inside the penthouse the Viper was bleeding from a wound no blade could inflict. Dante knelt on the cold, polished wood, surrounded by the hollow trappings of a king. For 20 years he had been the phantom of the Midwest, a man of iron and ice who decided the fate of hundreds with a single bloodless nod. They said his heart was dead. They were wrong. It was just buried under 1,000 layers of custom-tailored armor. Tonight that armor was a crumpled wreck. His shirt was torn open, his face masked by a week's worth of jagged stubble and the salt of a man who had forgotten how to weep. Before him sat a small, battered suitcase and a 6-year-old girl named Emma, whose eyes held the terrifying golden warmth of a woman who had just walked out of his life and into the shadows. He stared at the note crumpled in his fist. "She's yours now." Those 3 words were a death sentence for the man he used to be. The hands that had signed warrants of execution and squeezed triggers without a blink now hovered, trembling, over a tattered teddy bear. He reached out to touch her dark curls, but his fingers, calloused by the steel of a dozen wars, seemed too rough, too rigid for the fragile life before him. He had ruled through fear, building an empire on the bones of his enemies. He thought he was invincible. But as he looked into the unblinking stare of his own blood, the Viper realized a brutal truth. All his power, all his millions, all his terrifying silence meant absolutely nothing. The man who made the underworld shudder was now completely, utterly helpless. And then the impossible broke. Tears, hot and heavy, slid down his face, soaking into the old battle scars he wore like a mask. Dante Russo wasn't just falling apart. He was being reborn in a storm of grief. He wasn't kneeling before an assassin. He was kneeling before the weight of being a father. The Viper was gone. There was only a man, a girl, and the terrifying realization that for the first time in his life he finally had something worth losing. The penthouse on the 50th floor had always been a tomb of glass and cold ambition. A place where Dante Russo retreated to count his victories in the suffocating silence of the Chicago skyline. But tonight the silence was shattered by a sound he didn't recognize, the soft, rhythmic breathing of a life he never chose. He stood paralyzed in the center of the living room, his shadow stretched long and jagged against the Italian marble, looking down at the small, sleeping figure huddled on his designer sofa. Beside her sat a pink backpack scuffed at the edges, and a single cream-colored envelope that felt heavier than the leaden weight of a .45 caliber slide. With hands that had once signed death sentences without a flicker of hesitation, Dante reached for the paper. His fingers, calloused by decades of holding steel and crushing opposition, fumbled with the seal as if it were the most intricate lock he had ever encountered. He pulled the note free, the sharp scent of a perfume he had tried to forget, Meredith's scent or perhaps a ghost of it, filling his lungs like wood smoke. The words were few, written in a frantic, slanted hand that screamed of a woman running out of time. "She's yours now. I can't keep her safe and I can't keep living this lie. Her name is Emma. Don't look for me." A cold sweat broke across Dante's brow, soaking into the expensive fabric of a shirt that suddenly felt like a straitjacket. He looked from the ink to the girl, whose dark curls spilled across the silk cushions like a stain of ink on a white shroud. This was the Viper's legacy, not a business empire built on financial laundries and private loans, but a 6-year-old mirror of his own haunted eyes. The world outside lay buried under a relentless, indifferent snow, but inside Dante's chest, a different kind of winter was taking root. He realized with a staggering, gut-punching clarity that the ghost of Chicago had finally been caught. He wasn't being hunted by the FBI or a rival captain. He was being haunted by a past he thought he had buried deep beneath the frozen earth. He stood there, a king in a fortress that suddenly felt like a cage, staring at the daughter who was now his only truth and his greatest terror. The sun rose over Chicago not with a promise, but with the harsh, cold glare of a witness to a crime. Dante stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, the rare winter light cutting across the sharp, scarred planes of his face, making him look more like a relic of a forgotten war than a king of the underworld. Below him, the city began to churn, a million souls moving in a jagged dance of survival. But inside the penthouse on the 50th floor, the air was thick with a silence that felt like a tomb. This was his fortress, a sanctuary of Italian leather, cold marble and fine art that demanded absolute silence. Now that silence was haunted by the ghost of a child's presence. Emma was awake. She sat at the massive obsidian dining table, her small frame swallowed by a chair designed for men who sign death sentences with a flick of a gold pen. Dante watched her from the shadows of the kitchen, his heart pounding with a rhythmic dread he hadn't felt since the night his father was gunned down. He had commanded legions and made the city shudder, yet he stood paralyzed by the simple task of a morning meal. His hands, which had squeezed triggers without a blink, now fumbled with a porcelain bowl as if it were a live grenade. He set a plate of dry toast before her, the clatter of fine china echoing like a gunshot in the sterile room. He wanted to speak, to offer some fragment of comfort, but his voice was a rusted blade, and used to the softness a 6-year-old required. He had spent 7 years turning his heart to ice, and now he was drowning in the thaw. The girl didn't eat. She only stared at him with amber eyes that held 1,000 questions he wasn't ready to answer. Eyes that were a constant, aching reminder of the light he had lost. Every corner of the penthouse screamed of his isolation. The expensive furnishings offered no warmth. The towering panes of glass offered only a view of a world he no longer understood. He realized then that he had built a kingdom of shadows, and he had no idea how to let the sunlight in. He was the viper, the ghost who never made a mistake, yet he was utterly, hopelessly lost in the simple geography of a home. He looked at the daughter he had never known, and for the first time in his life, the man feared by an entire city was afraid of his own reflection in the eyes of a child. The darkness of the 50th floor was a suffocating shroud, a vast emptiness that all the costliest luxury in the world couldn't fill. Dante stood in the doorway of the guest suite, his black custom-tailored suit crushed and wrinkled like a balled-up sheet of paper. Inside, Emma's sobs were low, jagged rhythmic breaks in the silence that cut deeper than any knife wound he'd ever sustained in the South Side trenches. He was the ghost, a phantom who never showed emotion, but tonight his armor was giving way to a hollow ache he couldn't conquer. He stepped into the room with the measured, heavy gait of a man who usually signed death sentences for his enemies. He didn't know how to be a father, he only knew how to be a kingpin. Dante approached the bed and sat with a rigid posture, his elbows braced on his knees, his hands clasped together as if he were presiding over a tense board meeting in the underworld. "Emma," he said, his voice rough and worn, sounding like a rusted blade. "Information is power. If you tell me why you are crying, I can fix the problem. Is the temperature incorrect? Is the security insufficient?" The girl only curled tighter into a ball, her trembling body fast as the wings of a frightened bird. Dante's brow furrowed. In his world, commands were met with absolute silence or immediate action. He reached for his phone, opening a 24-hour advice line as if it were a tactical briefing for a warehouse raid. He tried to rock her the way a video on his screen demonstrated, but his calloused hands seemed too rough, too rigid to offer the softness the child needed. He turned on a lullaby app, the gentle melodies floating through the room like a haunting mockery of the peace he couldn't provide. "I have secured this perimeter," he whispered, his voice trembling at the edge of a collapse he had spent 30 years preventing. "You are safe here." But Emma didn't want safety, she wanted her mother. The fingers that had once squeezed a trigger without blinking now fumbled with the edge of her blanket as though it were the most complicated weapon he had ever touched. He realized then that he was trying to negotiate with grief, treating a broken heart like a hostile takeover. He was the man feared by an entire city, yet he was completely helpless before the sound of his own child crying. The ghost was reaching the bottom, standing in the dark at 3 o'clock in the morning, realizing that all his power meant nothing. The rain in Chicago didn't fall. It assaulted the glass, a relentless drumming that sounded like the frantic heartbeat of a man running out of time. Dante stood at the mahogany bar of the Obsidian, a low-lit sanctuary for men who traded in shadows and silence. He was a different man in private now, his eyes sunken from nights spent reading bedtime stories in a penthouse fortress that still felt like a gilded cage. He looked down at his glass, the amber liquid reflecting a face he barely recognized, a face no longer cold as steel, but etched with the jagged exhaustion of a father who didn't know how to love. Then came Sophia Walker. She didn't approach him with the trembling fear he was used to seeing in the eyes of the city. She moved with a calm professionalism that was almost infuriating, her gaze as steady as a predator's. When she set his drink down, her sharp eyes caught his, and for a moment, the air in the crowded bar seemed to turn to ice. It wasn't the threatening stare all of Chicago feared. It was something deeper, a slow-burning glance that seemed to see right through the Viper's custom-tailored armor. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the world, Mr. Russo," she said, her voice a low, soothing melody that carried a feeling of safety he hadn't felt in years. Dante's hand, the one that had signed death sentences and squeezed triggers without blinking, tightened around his glass. He wanted to offer a command to remind her exactly who he was, but the words died in his throat. There was a naked honesty in her presence that made his mask of steel feel like a balled-up sheet of paper. They exchanged whispered confessions in the dim light, stolen moments that began to crack his hardened soul like a hammer hitting a frozen lake. He didn't know that she was investigating him, that her sharp eyes were searching for the cracks he was only just beginning to show. All he knew was that for the first time since the light in his life had gone out, he felt like he could draw a deep breath without that crushing tightness closing around his chest. As he looked at Sophia, Dante felt a flicker of something dangerous. Not the heat of anger, but the warmth of a hope he wasn't sure he deserved. The ghost was still there, but beneath the armor, a heart he thought was dead was beginning to beat with the terrified wings of a frightened bird. The cold glass of the penthouse windows stood like a silent barricade against a world that was slowly tightening its noose. Inside, the Viper was unrecognizable, stripped of the custom-tailored armor that had made the Chicago underworld shudder. Dante sat on the edge of a small bed, the soft glow of a night lamp casting long, jagged shadows across his battle-scarred face. In his hands he held a book of fairy tales, the pages feeling fragile and alien against fingers that had once fumbled with baby bottles like they were complicated weapons. His voice, usually a blade of ice that demanded absolute silence, was now a low, gravelly whisper, stumbling through stories of magic and light for a daughter who carried her mother's soul in her unblinking stare. While Dante struggled to find the right words for a 6-year-old, the world of shadows he had built was beginning to bleed into the light. Miles away, in a room drowned in the sterile blue glare of surveillance monitors, the FBI moved with the calm precision of predators who had finally caught a scent. They traded in evidence and cold facts, their eyes fixed on the man who had never left a trace. To them, Dante Russo was not a father trying to fix a broken heart. He was a kingpin whose fatal weakness had finally been exposed. Every bedtime story, every moment of vulnerable fatherhood, was being logged as a crack in the fortress. Dante remained oblivious, caught in the suffocating silence of a home that was finally beginning to breathe with the sound of life. He didn't see the slow-burning glances Sophia Walker exchanged with her handlers, nor did he realize that the woman who had made him feel like he could draw a deep breath was the very person mapping the cracks in his soul. He was a man coming apart from the inside, trading his terrifying reputation for the chance to see his daughter sleep peacefully. The sirens weren't audible yet, lost beneath the hiss of the winter wind, but the darkness was no longer just a secret. It was a trap. As he closed the book and tucked the blanket around Emma, the Viper didn't know that the empire he had sacrificed everything to protect was already collapsing, one whispered confession at a time. The amber light of the bar was a flickering sanctuary against the Chicago sleet, casting long, jagged shadows across Dante's face as he sat in the booth's velvet darkness. Across from him, Sophia Walker didn't look like a threat. She looked like the first rain after a long and merciless drought. Dante stared into his glass, the Viper's mask of steel finally cracking under the weight of 100 sleepless nights. For 30 years he had been a phantom who never showed emotion, but tonight his voice was a broken sob, a strange sound he didn't even recognize as his own. "I was taught that love was a luxury men like me were never allowed to have," he whispered, his hands, the same ones that had once signed death sentences, trembling as they rested on the table. He told her about the boy who grew up in a house where tears meant punishment, where he had to learn to freeze his own heart just to survive his father's fists and lashes. He spoke of Emma, and how the fear of not being enough for her was a crushing tightness closing around his chest, a pain more enduring than any knife wound from the Southside trenches. Sophia reached out, her fingers brushing his calloused skin with a softness that made his armor feel like a balled-up sheet of paper. In that moment the ghost was stripped bare, confessing that his empire meant nothing if he couldn't save the light in his daughter's eyes. He didn't see the flicker of conflict in Sophia's sharp gaze, the way she seemed to be weighing every whispered confession against the mission she was sworn to complete. Dante leaned in, his eyes sunken deep and ringed with shadows, yet for the first time in 7 years, they held a glimmer of something other than ice. He was a man falling apart and somehow healing at the same time, offering her the raw, stolen pieces of a heart he had believed was dead. As the sirens of his world began their distant, invisible crawl toward him, Dante Russo allowed himself to believe that the one who understands pain is the only one who can heal it. The cold wind of a Chicago winter didn't just scrape against the glass of the penthouse. It howled with the scent of an impending storm. Below the family level, in the darkened war rooms where the Vance Syndicate's heart usually beat with icy precision, the air had turned thick with the musk of betrayal. Marcus Holt wasn't the only predator testing the waters. The rot was starting from within. Dante's underboss, a man who had seen the Viper fire a gun for the first time at 13, now stood in the shadows of a South Side warehouse, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He spoke in hurried, whispered breaths to the captains, his eyes sunken deep and ringed with a new kind of greed. "The ghost is gone," he hissed, the words cutting through the tense silence like a blade. "He's trading death sentences for bedtime stories. 3 months without appearing is too long in our world, and now we know why." He laughed, a strange sound that held no warmth, only the cold calculation of a man who had learned that emotion was a fatal weakness. The captains shifted, their black custom-tailored suits casting long, jagged shadows against the concrete. They remembered the man who ruled with an iron fist, the phantom who never made a mistake. But the stories of the disheveled kingpin fumbling with baby bottles and weeping over old photographs had begun to spread like a sickness. To these men, Emma wasn't a daughter. She was a target, the greatest weakness the Viper had ever had in his life. "He thinks he can protect her in a penthouse fortress, but even a ghost needs to breathe," the underboss continued, his gaze fixed on the flickering nightlights of the city. "If he won't lead us into war, we'll find someone who will. The organization needs to see who is truly in control." As the sirens of the underworld began to wail in the distance, Dante remained in the nursery, oblivious to the fact that his own shadow was sharpening its knife. The dam was full, the pressure was straining, and the man who had sacrificed everything to expand his empire was about to find out that his enemies wouldn't wait for him to finish mourning before they struck. The memories rushed back like a tide that couldn't be held back, cold and jagged as a Chicago winter. Long before he was the Viper, Dante was a man forced into a crown of thorns at 25, watching his father bleed out on a warehouse floor during an internal reckoning. He had only 2 choices: seize power or die beside the man who had taught him that emotion was a fatal weakness. He chose to live, but in doing so he froze his own heart to survive in a house where tears meant punishment and love was a luxury never granted. Then came Olivia Lawson. She wasn't like the others. She looked at the ghost with unblinking eyes that held no trace of fear. She saw through every layer of armor he had spent years building, but unlike Meredith, Olivia's love was a storm of fire and strain. Dante remembered the night she told him she was pregnant, sitting on the sofa in the penthouse living room with a mixture of happiness and worry. He had gone rigid, his body tightening like a wire pulled too hard, because he was terrified, afraid of the violence in his blood, afraid of bringing a child into his world of shadows. "I don't know how to be a father, Olivia," he had whispered, his hands trembling as they signed death sentences for his enemies. He believed he was incapable of tenderness, a man built only for war and absolute power. He saw his own father's heavy footsteps in his reflection and feared he would only pass down the fists and lashes that had marked his own stolen childhood. Olivia had promised to stay beside him, but the darkness he carried eventually swallowed the light. She couldn't endure the life of a man followed everywhere by shadows, and Dante convinced himself his hands were too rough, too rigid to ever offer the softness a child needed. He was the man an entire city feared, yet he believed he was a failure who didn't deserve to be a father. He had let her go because he believed the Viper had no place in the life of a child, never knowing that the fear of ruining everything was the only proof that he already loved her. The shadows of the Chicago underground grew long and jagged, moving with the cold calculation of a predator that had finally found its opening. In the gut of a derelict foundry where the air tasted of iron and ancient blood, the underboss stood waiting. He was a man who had served the Vance Syndicate since before Dante was born, but his loyalty had been eroded by the sight of the viper, trading his fangs for bedtime stories. Then a figure stepped out from the darkness, her presence a silent scream in the void. Olivia Lawson had resurfaced, her eyes no longer warm as honey but cold as the soundproof glass of a penthouse tomb. She looked at the underboss with the unblinking stare of a woman who had traded her soul for a chance to reclaim what she believed was hers. "He's soft," the underboss hissed, his voice a low, jagged rasp that cut through the tense silence. "The ghost is drowning in milk and guilt, spending his nights whispering to a photograph instead of ruling with an iron fist." He laughed, a strange sound that held no warmth as he showed her the surveillance footage of Dante, the man an entire city feared, kneeling on a wooden floor, completely helpless before the sound of his own child crying. Olivia didn't flinch. She saw the vulnerable fatherhood, not as a redemption but as a target. "His heart was never dead," she whispered, her voice trembling at the edge of a different kind of malice. "It was just waiting for something to lose." Together they began to map the final betrayal, weaving a web of secrets that would turn Dante's fortress into a cage. They coordinated with a lethal, silent efficiency, planning to weaponize the very thing that had brought the viper to his knees: his love for Emma. While Dante sat in the penthouse, oblivious to the storm, the trap was set with the same cold precision he had once used to sign death sentences for his enemies. The sirens of his past were no longer a distant memory, they were a countdown, and the light he had finally found was about to be swallowed by a thick, suffocating dark. The fortress was breached not with the thunder of a breach charge, but with the chilling, hollow ringing of a phone that had no right to be active. Dante stood in the center of Emma's room, his custom-tailored suit crushed and wrinkled as he stared at the empty white crib, the tattered teddy bear lying face down on the polished wood like a fallen soldier. The silence of the penthouse, once a sanctuary of Italian leather and cold ambition, now felt like a tomb, confirming his greatest fear: that he was utterly, hopelessly alone in the one battle he couldn't afford to lose. He swiped the screen, his calloused hands trembling with a rhythmic dread that turned his heart to ice. Olivia's voice came through the line, a low, jagged rasp that cut through the darkness like a blade. "She's with me, Dante," she whispered, the words dripping with the cold calculation of a final wish. "I told you I couldn't keep her safe, but I never said I wouldn't weaponize her." Before he could roar an answer, the line went dead, leaving him drowning in a thick, suffocating dark where every empire he had built meant absolutely nothing. Desperate for a life raft in the middle of this ocean of despair, Dante turned to the only person he believed he could trust. He found Sophia in the living room, her sharp eyes fixed on him with a mixture of happiness and worry that he now realized was a mask of steel. As he reached for her, his eyes sunken deep and ringed with shadows, he saw the silver glint of her badge and the sterile blue glare of the FBI surveillance team closing in through the towers of glass. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was her. The bartender with the slow-burning glances was the very phantom mapping the cracks in his soul. Sophia didn't lower her gaze, she only stood there, a silent observer of his collapse, her presence confirming that the woman who had made him feel he could draw a deep breath was the one tightening the noose. Dante stood stripped bare, his fingers fumbling with the tattered toy as he looked into the unblinking eyes of the woman who had stolen what was left of his heart, realizing that in his world, love was a luxury that had finally cost him everything. The rain had turned into a freezing sleet that rattled against the corrugated steel of the South Side warehouse like a hail of lead. Inside, the air was a thick, suffocating dark, smelling of rusted iron and the cold calculation of a final betrayal. Dante Russo stood in the center of the kill zone, his custom-tailored suit, once a symbol of his iron rule, now crushed and wrinkled as he faced the twin ghosts of his past, Olivia and the underboss who had traded loyalty for greed. Between them stood Emma, a tiny life only 6 years old, her golden warmth the only light left in a world drowned in darkness. "You wanted the viper," Dante rasped, his voice a rusted blade that had forgotten the sound of mercy. "But you're looking at a father." The underboss laughed, a strange sound that held no warmth, and signaled the captains assembled in the shadows. The first shot tore through the tense silence, a jagged rhythmic break that ignited a storm of bullets. Glass shattered and concrete splintered as the empire Dante had built with blood and time began to collapse around him. He didn't reach for the weapon at his hip to return fire. Instead, his calloused hands, once used to squeezing triggers without blinking, reached only for his daughter. In a move that shattered every rule of the underworld, Dante turned his back to the shooters. He lunged across the oil-slicked floor, his body a shield of meat and bone, wrapping himself around Emma as the air hummed with death. He felt the white-hot sting of a round catching him in the shoulder, then another in the ribs, but he didn't flinch. All the power he possessed, every territory he had conquered, and every enemy he had crushed meant absolutely nothing compared to the tiny heartbeat thudding against his chest. As sirens began to wail in the distance, Dante pulled her into the deepest state of protection he could offer, resting his forehead against the cold floor as he whispered a desperate prayer. The man feared by an entire city had finally been brought to his knees, not by an enemy's strength, but by the weight of a love he had finally learned to carry. In the middle of the storm, as blood soaked into his wrinkled shirt, the Viper was dead, and for the first time in 30 years, the man inside was truly alive. The world narrowed to the space between a heartbeat and a muzzle flash. As the underboss's finger tightened on the trigger, Dante Russo didn't see the empire he had built or the millions he had laundered. He saw only the amber eyes of a 6-year-old girl who deserved a father, not a ghost. He lunged through the freezing air, his body a shield of bruised flesh and custom-tailored wool, eclipsing Emma just as the warehouse erupted in a jagged rhythmic break of gunfire. The impact was a white-hot hammer blow to his back, a force that tore through his muscle and sent him crashing to the oil-slicked concrete. He felt the wet warmth of his own blood soaking into his wrinkled shirt, a stain of failure that was finally being replaced by the price of protection. As he hit the floor, he pulled Emma into the deepest state of safety his shattered frame could offer, his calloused hands, once used to squeezing triggers without blinking, now cradling her head with a softness that defied 30 years of iron rule. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the faint hiss of the winter wind beyond the corrugated steel. Dante looked up, his eyes sunken deep and ringed with shadows, to see the shock traveling through the line of his enemies. They had expected the Viper to strike. They hadn't expected a man to bleed for something other than power. Olivia stood frozen, her eyes wide as though lightning had struck her from a clear sky, realizing that the darkness she had tried to weaponize had been conquered by a light she could no longer extinguish. Dante rested his forehead against the cold floor, his voice sinking into a whisper like a desperate prayer as he felt the tiny, terrified heartbeat of his daughter against his chest. He wasn't the ghost anymore, a phantom who never made a mistake. He was a father whose blood on the floor was the only truth he had left to give. In that moment of breaking, as the sirens finally began to wail at the gates, Dante Russo knew his heart was never dead. It was simply waiting for the one thing worth dying for, proving that the man who ruled Chicago with an iron fist had finally found the strength to fall apart for his child. The sirens were no longer a distant wail. They were a tidal wave of blue and red light crashing against the warehouse's rusted skeleton. Inside the storm of dust and cordite, Sophia Walker stood at the precipice of the life she was sworn to uphold and the man she had learned to see. Her sharp eyes moved from the bleeding Viper on the floor to the shadow of the underboss, who was raising his weapon for a final cowardly execution. In that heartbeat, the investigator died and a protector was born. Sophia didn't shout an order for arrest. She moved with a lethal fluency that turned her into a second shadow, firing a single decisive round that took the underboss in the shoulder, spinning him into the darkness of the industrial ruins. She turned her gaze to Olivia, who was scrambling for the pink backpack as if it were a bag of laundered money rather than her daughter's life. "It's over, Olivia." Sophia's voice rang through the hollow chamber, as calm as the surface of an undisturbed lake, yet as unyielding as the soundproof glass of a 50th floor tomb. As FBI tactical teams breached the perimeter, Sophia stepped between the barrels of her own agents and the man kneeling on the oil-slicked concrete. She watched as Olivia was forced into cuffs, her greed finally costing her the only light she had ever possessed. Dante looked up at Sophia, his eyes sunken deep and ringed with shadows. A man who had finally reached the bottom and found someone waiting there. Sophia reached down and took the tattered teddy bear from the floor, handing it back to Emma before resting her hand on Dante's blood-soaked shoulder. She didn't offer a mirage of safety or the empty phrases of a mission report. She simply stayed there, present, allowing the ghost to breathe in a world where he was no longer a criminal, but a father who had finally been found. She had seen the ugliness and the darkness, and in this moment of breaking she chose the man over the ghost. The rare sunlight of a Chicago winter finally broke through the iron-gray clouds, laying warm golden streaks across the blood-stained concrete of the warehouse floor. It was the first time in many weeks that Dante had seen the sun, and he realized with a staggering clarity that he had forgotten what the warmth of light on his skin felt like. He sat against a rusted support beam, his daughter Emma still clutched against his chest, her steady breathing the only music that mattered in a world that had finally stopped screaming. Sophia stood a few feet away, her silhouette framed by the rising dawn. She had stripped away the badge and the mission, her sharp eyes no longer looking at a kingpin to be dismantled, but at a man who had finally been found. Dante looked up at her, his eyes sunken deep and ringed with shadows, yet for the first time in 7 years, they held the peace of a lake after a storm. The Viper was a ghost now, a relic of a past buried under the white snow of 1,000 mistakes. "I don't know how to be an ordinary man," he whispered, his voice rough and worn, yet firm with a new kind of certainty. "But I know I don't want my daughter to inherit an empire built on fear. I want her to see her father and not have to look for the shadows." He reached out his hand, not the hand that had signed death sentences, but the one that had learned to hold a tattered teddy bear, and Sophia took it. In that simple touch, the fortress of the 50th floor finally ceased to be a tomb. Dante realized that true strength didn't lie in the absolute power he had wielded over the city, but in the vulnerability of allowing someone to stay beside him while he fell apart. As the sirens faded into the distance and the first signs of spring began to melt the bitter edge of the winter, Dante Russo stood up. He wasn't ruling Chicago anymore. He was protecting a home. He looked at Emma, then at Sophia, and then out at the city waking beneath the fragile sunlight. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. He was looking forward. The man who had been the ghost was gone, and in his place was a father who finally knew that simply being here, present and imperfect, was the greatest power he would ever possess.